welcome back to this lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Plato's Apology, but we're going to do so in a way that strays a little bit from the text itself, but in a way that hopes to give you further context to understand many of the main points Socrates is talking about, and specifically the points he is making about sophistry. So let's recall from our previous discussion that Socrates says, well, I'm facing these official accusations that I'm technically being brought to trial for. But I also have all these old accusations that aren't technically being brought against him, but he worries will sway the jury of his peers who is going to decide on his life or death. Now, as we discussed, there's two of these old accusations. One is the accusation of natural philosophy. Essentially, put in more modern terms, the accusation that Socrates is a scientist, that he replaces spiritual or religious explanations of natural phenomena with physical explanations. But we said there's also the second, and I think more important accusation, the accusation that Socrates is a sophist. And remember the way this accusation was explained. The accusation is that Socrates does two things. He makes the weaker argument the stronger, and teaches these things to other people. So what does this mean? Well, we said to make the weaker argument stronger would be to have the ability to take a bad argument, a false, unfounded, or unsound argument, and make it sound very good to people in a way that's persuasive and convincing. And then we can see why this would be a worry, because there were these individual sophists who had this ability, or thought they had this ability, and not only do they have it, but they taught it to others. They went around charging a fee and teaching mostly the young men in Athens who came from wealthy parents how to give very persuasive speeches, be masters of rhetoric, and even if what you're saying has little substance, little logic, little facts, to make it sound very good, sound very persuasive. And for this reason, the sophists didn't have the best reputation in Athens, and you can see why this sort of ability would be damaging and potentially very harmful in a democracy. In a democracy where the people hold political power, and where your ability to get people to support you and gain votes determines how much influence you will have, it would be worrying if you could garner influence and garner support with bad arguments that sound very good. So this is the accusation against Socrates. Now, a couple things we know. First, Socrates was not a sophist, even if it may have looked like that. He did have many young followers, and he said, he lived a very different life from the average Athenian, and so he was easily grouped into that sort of person. But in fact, not only is he not a sophist, which he gives as evidence the fact that he never charges a fee for anything he does and lives in abject poverty, but not just that, he's critical of sophistry. In fact, Socrates sees sophistry as fundamentally opposed to every value and important commitment of philosophy. And in this video, we're going to delve into that a little deeper. And to do so, again, I want to look at some passages coming from both Plato and others that are going to give us a little further context about sophistry and why Socrates is so opposed to it. So first, I want to understand sophistry a little better on its own terms. And here are three famous statements from one particular sophist named Protagoras. And each of these gives you a sort of insight into the mind of a sophist. So, and why it is specifically that sophists focus so much on making an argument sound good as opposed to pursuing the truth. So the first quote we see from Protagoras here expresses a sort of fundamental relativism. Protagoras famously says, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not." So what does this mean? This means fundamentally, Protagoras is telling us there are no objective truths. That when you want to know whether something, when you want to know what's true about the world, there is no truth out there. There is no truth that we're all subject to. Rather, everyone sort of makes their own truth. So if we're imagining, okay, well, should we adopt this public policy? Which direction should our political community go in? You might say, well, we want to get to the truth of the matter. What will be the best for the community? The relativists will say there's really no truth about what's good or bad. Everyone decides their own view on good and bad. Good and bad and many other truths are fundamentally subjective. That's why he says man is the measure of all things. And presumably, we might say each individual person is the measure of what they see as true or false. So Protagoras is a relativist about truth. He also has a statement here that expresses skepticism. So he says, well, suppose there are some truths, right? What is the likelihood that we're actually going to be able to learn about those truths or figure out what those truths are? So he says, concerning the gods, and this is just one example, about whether the gods exist and what they're like, I'm unable to know either that they are or that they are not, or what their appearance is like. For many are the things that hinder knowledge, the obscurity of the matter and the shortness of life. So he says, look, even if there are objective truths about morality or the gods or how a proper political system should be set up, he expresses skepticism that we're in any position or have any ability to determine what those truths are. He says, the matters are difficult and obscure. Our lives are so short. We have, a small sliver of time that we're alive. How are we going to make intellectual progress? So he's also very skeptical. He's just very pessimistic about the idea that human beings can use our reason to discover what the truth is, even if there are objective truths. And you see the same point in this last quote, where he talks about the weakness of human reason. He says, look, on any issue there are two opposing arguments. And you've probably encountered this fact if you're having a religious, political, or moral debate with someone, or you're thinking through an issue in religion, morality, and politics, and wondering what side should I be on, what should I believe? Then you say, well, let's see what people are saying. And you find maybe not just two different arguments, two different sides, but a multiplicity, a wide variety of different perspectives and arguments. And when you think about that, it says, well, if human reason really is capable of discovering the truth, then why do so many people disagree? Why are there so many different arguments? And so you say, what Protagoras wants to suggest is, human reason is not capable of finding the truth. So what can human reason do? What can we do with our intellectual faculties? If we can't find the truth of the matter, maybe we can at least use reason to, as he says here, quote, make the weaker argument the stronger. Look, you're never going to be able to find out what's true, what's good, but you can at least make what you're saying sound good. And if you have the ability to make the weaker argument the stronger, then you're really a skilled rhetorician. And if you're a skilled rhetorician, you can gain power. And maybe at the end of the day, that's really all there is. There is no truth. There's just a lot of people talking, a lot of people arguing, jockeying, and fighting for power. So this is fundamentally the perspective of a sophist. And if all those claims are true, you can see why the sophist wouldn't be so concerned with the pursuit of truth as the philosopher is. Because either the truth doesn't exist or we just can't discover it. So what's the point? Let's focus on rhetoric. Now, I want us to take seriously for a moment and really think about this perspective. Because I think if this perspective is adopted, it has really some radical consequences that we need to think about seriously. So, if the sophists are right, if Protagoras is right, then we can't use rational discussion to resolve our disputes. If we have a moral, political, or religious dispute with someone, a disagreement, there's really no point in engaging in rational discussion about it, because either our reason is too weak or there's really nothing to argue about. There is no truth. But we're still going to have conflicts in society. People are going to want different things. They have different self-interest. They have different visions of what's good. They have different ideas about what would be best for our community. So if we can never resolve our disputes through rational discussion, then what is left for us? What can we do? Well, if there's no way of productively sitting down and talking with one another, of sharing our perspectives and coming to a consensus, but we've still got to resolve our conflicts somehow, then we can either, separate off from one another, just not associate, only associate with those who are similar, or if we have to associate with those who are dissimilar, it seems the only real the avenue left is conflict. And of course that conflict can take a variety of forms. One would hope it wouldn't become violent, but throughout the history of humanity, violence as a method of resolving various conflicts about what we believe is true, about our moral, political, and religious beliefs, is commonplace. And so the ultimate end of the point of view of sophistry is a sort of insurmountable conflict. It's a sort of conflict which we can't get around by talking with one another peaceably, because at the end of the day, there just is nothing to talk about. Now, of course, this isn't the most attractive vision, and so if you're like Plato, if you're like Socrates, you hope that there's another answer. In fact, you hope that there is a truth out there, that we can collectively use our reason to arrive at it, and through discussion of the sort that Socrates has with his interlocutors, we can make progress in achieving that truth. And for this reason, Socrates levels a sort of critique at sophistry, which really aims to show how different it is from philosophy. And here we have to go to a different dialogue from Plato. So this isn't one that you are doing in your reading for this week. I'm just going to pull a few passages which I hope will make this point. But this is another dialogue of Plato's called Gorgias. And Gorgias was also a sophist. You can see his picture here. The main thing to know about Gorgias is that he was characterized by a very flashy, ostentatious style. Sort of an expert of rhetoric, a very persuasive person, the kind of individual that people gravitated towards in the way he talked. And if we take Socrates at his word, he's just the opposite of Socrates, who at the beginning of the Apology, you'll recall, says, look, I'm just going to use whatever words come to mind. I'm going to have a plain spoken manner. I'm not going to try to pull any rhetorical tricks. So in this dialogue, we see a collision between Socrates and Gorgias, who in style are very different. And not only are they very different in style, they're also very different in substance. And in the Gorgias, Plato has Socrates use a pair of analogies to explain why philosophy is so much different from sophistry. Now you can see I've outlined the analogies here. He says there's something similar about medicine and philosophy, and there's something similar about pastry baking and oratory or sophistry. Now we're going to get to the details of those comparisons in a second. But first, he also has this other split. He says there's certain crafts, so there's certain activities that deal or care for the body, and there's certain crafts or activities that deal or care for the soul. So before continuing, we should say a few things about what we mean, or what Plato and Socrates mean by the concept of a soul. There's really two things we can say here. And this is important because the soul is going to be a very important topic of discussion as we move forward, particularly in the Phaedo. But the first thing to say about the soul is that there's when we use the term soul, we're saying something about who we are as a person. So for Plato and Socrates, what it is that makes you who you are fundamentally, what determines who you are, is your soul. It's not primarily your body. It's not the flesh and blood that you see in front of you that's walking around. No, it is your soul. And Socrates and Plato believe that the soul is non-physical. So it's an immaterial substance. It can separate from our physical body, and when our body dies, our soul lives on after it. So Socrates believed in this. He did believe in an immaterial soul that could outlast your death. So that's one aspect of the soul. But there's also another thing to keep in mind, because I use the phrase care for the soul. In fact, in the Apology, we see Socrates use this phrase. He says, care for the soul is the most important thing that one can worry about. And what this means is that your soul can be in good condition, or it can be in bad condition. And you might ask, well, how is that possible, right? How can what I do in this physical existence make a difference to an immaterial soul? Well, one way to think about it first is just a more commonplace way of thinking. Whether you believe in an immaterial soul or not, you all understand the basic colloquial phrase of, yeah, that was really fun, but it was bad for my soul. A great example of this, of course, would be something like reality television. Yeah, it might feel good in the moment. There you are binging on The Bachelor or Bachelorette, and it's enjoyable and I suppose pleasurable in a very odd and disturbing sort of way, but you know deep down that this is just bad for your soul. It's bad for you as a person. And Socrates believed a certain sort of thing. He thought there are certain activities we can engage in that are bad for our soul, that make the condition of our soul worse, namely the immediate pursuit of pleasure, giving in to our appetites. But there's also things we can do to improve the condition of our soul. And what does this include? The pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of virtue, and the pursuit of justice. Learning as much as you can, seeking the truth through philosophy, being a good, virtuous person who treats others justly. All these things improve the condition of the soul. So, we have certain activities that care for the body, certain activities that deal with or care for the soul. Now, let's take a look at, first, this analogy between pastry baking and oratory or sophistry. So the first thing to notice is that pastry baking is something that has to do with the body, right? So if you're a pastry baker, you make sweet treats, which people eat, and it has a certain effect on your body. On the other hand, oratory or sophistry has an effect on your soul. And this, you can see how it makes some sense, right? Being convinced by flattering speeches has to do with your ideas. It has to do with your ways of thinking. So it's not strictly with the body in the way that pastry baking is. And we can see in the Gorgias how oratory or sophistry is characterized. So Socrates says, look, oratory is a producer of persuasion. It's not admirable at all. It's mere flattery. Okay, so think about that for a second. He wants to make this comparison. He says, look, here's what's wrong with sophistry. It's just mere flattery, right? There's no substance to it. Well, why in the world would that be similar to pastry baking? Okay, so, you imagine someone who is baking a cake. The people come to the bakery and they eat it. They say, this is delicious. It's really pleasurable and enjoyable. And look, there's nothing wrong with that from time to time. But what doesn't pastry baking do? Well, for one, if you eat too many sweets, obviously that's unhealthy for you. It's bad for your body to eat too many sweets. In moderation, sure, fine. But if overindulge isn't good for your health. And there's another sense in which pastry baking would be similar to flattery. When you flatter someone, you tell them what they want to hear. You make them feel good. And this is what sophistry essentially does. But there's a sense in which pastry baking does it as well. When you eat sweets, when you eat sweet-tasting things like cakes and cookies, it doesn't challenge you. It doesn't make you strive to become a better person. It doesn't improve you in any material sense. It just gives in to your immediate appetites. It gives you what you want in that moment. So why is sophistry like that? Well, imagine you were someone who's a very skilled rhetorician. Imagine you were a politician in Athens. And imagine there was a crowd in front of you who you needed to garner their votes in order to win the next election. Now, what would be the best way to go about doing that? Would the best way to do that to engage in a philosophical dialogue where you force the members of the audience to challenge their own beliefs and truly seek what is true? Probably not. As we've seen already with Socrates and Euthyphro and Socrates' comments to the jury, forcing people to challenge their own beliefs isn't really a way to endear them to you. No, I would suggest a more effective way of getting votes would be to flatter them, to tell them what they want to hear, to confirm their own biases, and if you can make it sound nice in the process, all the better. So we see sophistry is like pastry baking. It doesn't challenge you, it doesn't force you to improve, it doesn't force you to be critical, it just gives into your appetites, it gives into what you want, and it makes you feel good. Alright, now let's consider the other analogy, medicine and philosophy. Now, medicine is something that cares for the body, and Socrates says it corrects for weakness, disease, ugliness, and the like. So if you're sick, you go to a doctor, medicine helps you get better, of course. Philosophy, on the other hand, cares for your soul. And if it's going to be similar for medicine, it must have some sort of state that it corrects. And what does philosophy correct? Philosophy corrects the states of injustice, ignorance, cowardice, and the like. So Socrates thinks if you engage in philosophy, you'll become more just, you'll become more virtuous, and maybe most importantly, you'll become less ignorant. You'll gain knowledge. And this is important because you might recall, one of the things I said in an earlier video is that for Socrates, nothing can be worse for you than ignorance. And his philosophy, so if you suffering from ignorance, if there's things you don't know, and maybe more importantly, if there's things you don't know but you don't have the humility to admit it, then that's the worst state your soul can be in. The worst state your soul can be in is a condition of ignorance. If you engage in philosophy and seek the truth, you get rid of that ignorance, you get rid of that sickness of your soul, the sickness of your mind, and your soul becomes healthier. You gain knowledge. So those are the states that each corrects for, but the similarities between those go deeper. First of all, both medicine and philosophy are beneficial, right? So this quote, you might recall I actually discussed in the very first video in this series. It's a quote where Socrates says, seemingly so improbably, that I'm someone who would prefer to lose an argument rather than win it. And why would he prefer to lose an argument? Because if he loses an argument, it's shown that his view is incorrect, and he gets rid of some of his ignorance. He gains in knowledge. So he would rather lose an argument than show that another person is wrong, because he improves. And so medicine and philosophy are both beneficial. They take some lacking state, you're in a state of sickness, a state of ignorance, and they make it better. But on the other hand, both medicine and philosophy are also unpleasant, right? And Socrates explains this in particular. So I'll have to say more about why medicine is unpleasant in a second, and specifically when you think about when, the time period we're talking about, like 400 BC, the primitive state of medicine that we would be discussing is one that'd be very painful. But let's think about why philosophy is unpleasant. So here's another passage from the Gorgias. Socrates says, Gorgias, I take it that you, like me, have experienced many discussions that you've observed this sort of thing about them. It's not easy for the participants to define jointly what they're undertaking to discuss, and so having learned from and taught each other to conclude their session. Instead, if they're disputing some point and one maintains the other isn't right or isn't clear, they get irritated, each thinking the other is speaking out of spite. They become eager to win instead of investigating the subject under discussion. As I suggested to you before, one reason philosophy can be unpleasant is because it forces you to critically examine your own beliefs. It forces you to own up the fact that you might be wrong, and people don't enjoy being wrong. In fact, and for the most part, as Socrates says, they become eager to win. And if another person isn't agreeing with them, they get irritated. And so the prospect of being wrong, of having to examine one's own belief, is not a pleasant thing, just as medicine in the time of Socrates would also be a very unpleasant thing. Now, it's because this is the case. So, to recap, the sort of comparison is sophistry makes us feel good, doesn't challenge us. Philosophy does challenge us, does improve us, but is very painful. And Socrates says it's because he's a philosopher that he would predict he would not do well at trial. And of course this is sort of foreshadowing to what actually, or allusion to what actually happened to Socrates. Right, so, and this is one of my favorite passages from the Gorgias. Socrates says, why would I in fact fail at trial? He says, this is because the speeches I make on each occasion do not aim at gratification, but at what's best. They don't aim at what's most pleasant. And because I'm not willing to do those clever things you recommend, I don't know what to say in court. So Socrates says, look, I know maybe I could grovel, I could beg for my life. In fact, in the Apology, we're going to see a moment where Socrates says, I am not going to do the things people normally do in front of the jury. I'm not going to parade my family and friends and ask for pity or sympathy. I'm not going to do those things. I'm not going to do the things you want me to do that's going to gratify your appetites. So I'm not going to know what to say in court in terms of trying to save my own life. He says, I'll be judged the way a doctor would be judged by a jury of children if a pastry chef were to bring accusations against him. So he says, imagine a doctor is in front of a jury of children and is being charged by a pastry chef. Now remember, the pastry chef, just like the sophist, makes the children feel great about themselves, gives them cakes, cookies, and candies. The doctor, on the other hand, subjects the children, when they need it, to medicine that can be very painful, even if it is beneficial. And also keep in mind the way children evaluate things. So right now, my son is 1.5 years old, and I can tell you, to the extent that he evaluates whether things are good and bad, it is completely on the basis of pleasure. Things that he likes, things that he enjoys, for instance, on his birthday when he got a little cake and ice cream, that got a big smile. When he has to take a certain medicine, when he has to take his vitamin, let's just say there's less smiles. So he imagines this situation. He says, think about what a man like that, taken captive among these people, could say in his defense, the doctor. If someone were to accuse him and say, children, this man has worked many great evils on you. Yes, on you. He destroys the youngest among you by cutting and burning them, and by slimming them down and choking them, he confuses them. He gives them the most bitter potions to drink and forces hunger and thirst on them. He doesn't feast you on a great variety of sweets the way I do. So the pastry chef, look, that doctor, he forces you to undergo all these painful treatments, and all these things you don't like. But me, I just give you sweets. Now, what do you think a doctor caught in such an evil predicament could say? Or if he should tell them the truth and say, yes, children, I was doing all those things in the interest of health. How big an uproar do you think such judges would make? Wouldn't it be a loud one? And it's clear that Socrates sees his current predicament in much the same way. What Socrates is going to tell the jury is he's going to tell them that I know my philosophical questioning and my forcing you to examine your own beliefs has annoyed you. I know that you would much rather I speak to you as a sophist in a way that pleases you, in a way that gives into what you want, gives into your appetites. But I'm simply not going to do that. What I'm going to tell you is that your entire life should be spent in pursuit of philosophical truth. Your life should be spent trying to become a better, more just person. Your life should be spent caring for your soul. And when I tell you that those things are important, because they improve your soul, I know you're not going to understand. It's going to be as if I'm telling a group of children that the doctor is better than the pastry chef, even though the pastry chef gives them every single thing they want. And at the end of the day, this is Socrates' fundamental critique of sophistry. He admits it feels good, it gives you what you want, but only through philosophy, only through rational argumentation can we become better people. Can we become less ignorant? Can we become more virtuous? Can we become more just? And you don't get those things by simply giving in to your immediate needs, wants, and desires, and focusing on persuasion as opposed to truth. Okay, so I will stop there. I hope this video was informative and helpful, and I will see you in the next video.